Well, welcome to Mission in 5, the podcast where we ask a handful of questions to ministry practitioners to learn more about who they are and where they see God moving in their community. I'm your host, Greg Mamula. And every week, through my work with Churches Helping Churches, ABC Nebraska, my ongoing writing projects, and serving as a faculty mentor to seminary students, I get to partner with Christian leaders, entrepreneurs, and ministers of the church in a variety of contexts. I'm always amazed at the many and varied ways that God works in our individual communities and when multiple churches network together for mission and ministry. So, that's the purpose of this podcast, to share the stories of the people participating in God's mission in Nebraska, across the country, and around the world. My guest today is the Reverend Dr. Tod Bolsinger. Dr. Bolsinger joined Fuller Seminary in 2014 as a vice president for vocation and formation and assistant professor of practical theology. He now serves as a vice president and chief of leadership formation. Ordained in the Presbyterian Church USA in 1993, Dr. Bolsinger served in pastoral ministry for over 25 years before transitioning to Fuller. Tod is the author of several books, including It Takes a Church to Raise a Christian, How the Community of God Transforms Lives, published by Brazos in 2004, Canoeing the Mountains, Christian Leadership in Uncharted Territory, published by IVP Books in 2015, and most recently, Tempered Resilience, How Leaders Are Formed in the Crucible of Change, also published by IVP in 2020. He continues to write and teach in the areas of leadership, spiritual formation, leadership formation, and innovation. On November 18, 2021, 14 American Baptist regions will partner together to offer a free webinar titled Adaptive Leadership, where Dr. Tod Bolsinger will share insights from his book, Canoeing the Mountains, and other morsels of wisdom on leadership formation and innovation to encourage and equip our pastors and leaders for the ever-changing missional landscape that we find ourselves in. This event is free to the pastors of our American Baptist regions. Be sure to contact your region office to learn more and how to receive a Zoom link to log in and learn live with us on November 18, 2021. I really enjoyed my conversation with Dr. Bolsinger, and I think you will too. So use this opportunity to meet him before our big event later in November. If you're catching this after the event, well, we're sorry you missed the event, but we really hope you enjoy this conversation with Dr. Tod Bolsinger. Welcome to Mission in 5. I appreciate you joining us here on our podcast today.
I'm glad to be with you, Greg. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Our format is easy enough. We're going to ask you 5 simple questions to learn more about who you are and where you see God moving in your community. So let's just jump right in. Tell us a little bit about yourself. Who are you?
So I'm Tod Bolsinger, and I am the executive director for the Church Leadership Institute at Fuller Seminary. I'm also an associate professor of leadership formation there. And my wife and I run a consulting and coaching company and speaking called A.E. Sloan Leadership. It's named after a couple that mentored us, and they passed away, and we decided to rework our consulting and coaching and speaking and named it after them because they invested in us as young leaders. And so I basically wake up every day working with people trying to lead change across the country, and it's just a great gift.
Very good. Yeah. Do you have any hobbies when you're not teaching and doing a lot of consulting work or place?
Yeah, actually anything outside. So we have a little place in the mountains of Ketchum, Idaho, where in the wintertime, I cross country ski and downhill ski and snowshoe. And in the summertime, I fly fish and hike. And I actually fly fish in the wintertime also. Okay. So if I can play outside, I'm a happy guy.
Yes, I can see why you and Charles Revis probably get along so well. You have a lot of the same interests.
Yeah, he just gets to do it more than me because he lives up there all the time, and I have to go visit. So. Yeah,
he's always posting better pictures than all the other region staff at ABC. It's all these beautiful mountain scenes, so that's fun. Well, tell us a little bit about how you came to be on staff at Fuller, and then some of this consulting work. So, how did you get to this part of your vocational calling?
Yeah, so for 27 years, I was a Presbyterian pastor. I'm still ordained in the PCUSA. Okay. 10 years, I served on the staff at Hollywood Presbyterian, where I was on the staff, and I became an associate pastor. And then for 17 years at San Clemente Presbyterian, which is a little beach town halfway between Los Angeles and San Diego. Oh, fun. And that was a great gift. We went there when my son was 3 years old and my daughter was 3 months old. And I held up my daughter and said, "You're all invited to her high school graduation." And God gave us the desires of our hearts. We raised our kids, and I pastored that community. And along the way, I got a PhD at Fuller in practical theology and spiritual formation. And I ended up starting to do more work in leadership development because we had a consultant come in and work with us at a time when we were going through some transition. And that led to me doing a number of projects in my denomination and then being asked to do some coaching and consulting with that same company that had worked with us. And what it really did is it led me to recognize that I had this deep passion. I think it really is the center of my calling to help faith leaders thrive as change leaders. I think change is hard for everyone. Sometimes change, especially in the church, is especially hard.
Yeah.
And having to figure out how to help not only the change process, but the way in which the change process ends up changing us. And sometimes that can be deeply transformative in great ways, and sometimes it can be kind of dangerous and hard. And so that's the work that we do. After 27 years at the church, I was asked to go to Fuller Seminary. President Mark Labradon asked me to be his first appointee as a vice president, helping the seminary go through some change experiences that it was going through, because seminary education is in a time of deep flux. And after 6 years of being on the senior administration, I asked if I could just transition off and run this Church Leadership Institute and basically work every day with change leaders. And so it really has been my deep love for the church, my engagement in spiritual formation, and my understanding of the need to develop leaders to be able to lead change that has kind of led me to where I spend my life today.
Yeah. Would you then say that you were able to focus more on helping the church once you stopped being a local church pastor, because it gave you opportunity to try different things that might not have worked just specifically in your own context, but you tried to figure out how to apply these leadership change and adaptive leadership models in a variety of contexts?
Yeah, so the biggest interesting part about that, Greg, is I loved being the pastor of a congregation. I'm a deep dive kind of guy. I really am. But what I recognized was while that was great, there was also limitations to what I could offer others. Right. So I had a sense that my next season of life needed to be a bit more broad. I needed some broader exposure. And I had no idea how broad it would be. Yeah. Today, I literally get to work with people all over the theological spectrum, all over the country. I've got students in other countries. I get to do webinars and podcasts. And during the pandemic, I think I was in 4 other countries. I mean, it's really interesting that the disruption of the pandemic particularly meant that everybody is dealing with the same questions. How do we move from surviving this moment to thriving in what will come in the future? And so it has really given me this really deep breadth of experience. I tell people I get to talk to people who do not talk to each other. I talk across theological lines, denominational lines, and it's really a privilege. So I felt like after having this long season of a deep dive in a community, now I get the breadth of the body of Christ.
We know that you're an author of several books. You're continuing to work through the seminary. What are some of the things that are happening in this adaptive leadership that you're doing? Tell us a little bit about either your work at Fuller or the way that you're able to share this breadth of knowledge with others through your writing and your consulting.
Yeah. So I think the key point about adaptive leadership, and it's not mine, it came from Ronald Heifetz and Marty Linsky and their work at Harvard. Mm-hmm. I use their work, and I use the work of Ed Friedman and others who use family systems theory to really think about how do you create really healthy organizations to do wise, faithful change. Like it's not change for change's sake. Right. It's acknowledging that, in the church, it is like a family system that has something precious it wants to preserve. Right. But in a changing world, if you don't adapt, then you'll probably not survive either. So there's this really interesting dynamic. And the most interesting place where this is living itself out today, and maybe this is just because I see this because of the breadth, like I talked about earlier, is that many of the people who are the most interesting, creative, resilient leaders are not the people who grew the biggest churches and had the biggest movements in the last generation. Some of the most interesting creative stuff are happening in smaller congregations, in urban congregations, in many places where folks did not have kind of majority or dominant or privileged place before, developed the the ability to adapt and be creative and innovate in ways that we can learn from today. And so some of my very best students are women. They're people of color. They're pastors in small congregations. I'm working with 2 pastors in the country of New Zealand who are working on rethinking all of theological education in New Zealand to move away from its colonialist roots and take more seriously the indigenous people of New Zealand. I mean, there's just some very, very creative, deeply transformative work being put on by a number of my students and my clients around the country.
Okay, very good. Well, on November 18th, you're going to join 14 American Baptist regions on the Zoom call, and you're going to talk a little bit about adaptive leadership. We're pulling primarily from your work in Canoeing the Mountains, but you also have a book that launched at the beginning of 2021.
Tempered resilience. How leaders are formed in the crucible of change.
Yes, very good. Tell us a little bit, give us like a kind of a sneak preview of what we might hear in that type of a teaching experience with you.
Yeah. So Canoeing the Mountains came out in 2015, and I immediately got invited to speak to lots of groups, including a group of American Baptists in the Pacific Northwest. And what was interesting is the conversation very quickly went in almost every place to the section of the book that talked about sabotage. So one of the principles of adaptive change is the first one is people don't resist change, they resist loss. Right. People don't resist change, they resist loss. So what you start recognizing, especially in a church setting, is that it is very hard to disappoint the people that you are called to pastor. Ronald Heifetz says, he defines leadership as disappointing people at a rate they can absorb. And so the skill set that most of us were not prepared for is how much of having to lead change would mean we'd have to do so right into the teeth of disappointing the very people we love. Yeah. And then that led to one of the chapters in Canoeing the Mountains that everybody wanted to talk about, which was the chapter on sabotage. Ed Friedman says, you can't consider yourself successful until after you've made a change and then survived the resultant sabotage. That the normal process is you work to make a change, you make the change, everybody agrees to the change, and as soon as you start implementing it, the system will want to go back. It'll want to sabotage it to go back to the status quo. I often say the status quo does not easily let go. Right. And what then became is I began to realize that this was really the most soul-sucking part of the leadership process. I would talk to district superintendents or to Presbyterian executives or regional directors, and they would say things to me like, hey, I don't know if we have anybody who can actually do this. Yeah. And at first I thought that meant I need to do a better job of training them in techniques. And they said, no, I don't know if we have anybody who has the stomach for this. And so we started looking at what is the resilience needed to be able to bring change, to stay there in the face of resistance. And because these are people that we love and we care for and we're protecting and we're developing and protecting traditions that have shaped us, it can't just be kind of toughness. It can't just be being hard. It actually needs a tempered resilience, a kind of wise resilience, like a tempered tool. And so the process that I talk a lot about today is naming sabotage so that we can navigate it, and then developing the resilience needed through being formed so that we can actually lead people through it. And that's the work that I'll be doing with the group later this month.
And I think one of the things I enjoy most about hearing you speak and reading your books is this the idea of learning in real time. This idea of constantly being a learner, that you don't come in, you might have learned a lot in school or seminary or through a training program or whatever, but then you can't come into an alternate setting as an expert, but then you have to constantly be willing to learn. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I feel like from Canoeing the Mountains to Tempered Resilience is perfect evidence of you working through that type of learning process, continuing to develop. And then what does that mean for like a local church pastor who's living through that resilience and trying to do the Lewis and Clark, breaking it all down across the mountains kind of stuff?
Yeah. So that's a great observation, Greg, that for me, this is actually my own process of learning as I go. So, I was a pastor things were actually going pretty well at my church. All of a sudden I came into this weird moment where all of the usual markers were going up and to the right, the way you want them to go.
Yeah.
But the morale was going down. I didn't know what to make of that. And as soon as you come to the place where you realize I didn't have a solution and I had to say, man, I don't know what to do. What I don't know what this is.
Yeah.
That was the first time I learned about adaptive leadership. Adaptive leadership is where you lead when you're not an expert. And I didn't have an expert solution, so I had to learn.
Yeah.
What I discovered then was as you start developing the capacity to learn in an adaptive environment, an environment which we call uncharted territory, where there are no maps,
right,
you're always learning in the middle of leading. And this is a huge disappointment for most of us because
yeah.
we thought that we would learn everything we needed when we got our Master of Divinity, right? Like we sound like we're a superhero, right? We got our master's degree or we got our doctorate, and you're realizing actually what you're having to learn is that leadership is actually only learned while leading. And that alone begins to shift the way you approach. So I always say that, the great irony of my life is that you can't learn leadership from a book or getting a degree or doing workshops, says the guy who writes books, teaches people to get degrees and does workshops. Like I literally give you the tools, but you're not going to learn how to do it until you're in the middle of it. And this became extraordinarily clear when I started teaching on this material and realizing what everybody really wanted to talk about was one chapter of my book on sabotage, where I was just trying to name a reality that became literally the whole next book. And how do we actually develop that? And that's actually the book I'm working on now, came out of the last book, right? So it's really this process of my own formation while I'm working with leaders that is the exact same thing that leaders are going through every day.
Yeah. It's always interesting when you put something out like a book or something like a podcast series or whatever, and everybody comes back to one thing. You spend all these hours and weeks and months, and they're like, it was really just the one paragraph that we want to talk about.
Well, a lot of times it's not the one that you expected. Like
right.
I said, my whole life is usually being disrupted by somebody who whispers something to me on the side. And I think that just changed everything. Oh my gosh, that just changed everything. And that's been I would say the pattern of my life is somebody interrupting what I think I'm going to talk about because they want me to talk about what they want me to talk about.
Yeah, exactly. I just published a book myself, came out in the beginning of the year. It's called Table Life, an Invitation to Everyday Discipleship. And the idea is centered around meals and people coming together and taking communion in homes. Not terribly edgy stuff, but some scripture reading for the purpose of formation. But the thing people keep asking me about is listening, the discipline of listening.
Right.
In a season of absolute and utter chaos now, coming back to learning how to listen to each other well. And I feel like the rest of the book is really good too, but that's the one thing they keep asking me about. So I understand. It's pretty cool.
Yeah. To me, I think that's part of the way the Spirit works, right?
Yeah.
If you think about that, like the Spirit is, God disrupting our ideas to bring something new, to bring new life. And so, it makes sense to me that the idea of listening, which is such a forgotten art, would be at the forefront of people's experience. Because one of the parts we learned about resilience was people are more likely to follow you if you do a better job of listening to them so that they feel felt. If you listen to the place of deep empathy, then even if they don't agree with you, they will probably not, they will not likely sabotage you. That's a pretty profound.
I hope you are enjoying this episode of Mission in 5. Whether you're streaming this episode on Podbean, Spotify, iTunes, Google Podcasts, or iHeartRadio, thanks for listening. Take a moment to rate and review the podcast so it can be more easily found and to help us make the show better for other listeners. If you're feeling really good about it, go ahead and hit that share button to let others know how much you are enjoying Mission in 5. Don't forget to check out my book, Table Life, an Invitation to Everyday Discipleship. Table Life reveals the holy work of sharing our tables with others. It guides readers through the biblical tradition of mealtime practices and the discipleship habits of eating together, scripture formation, listening, storytelling, and communion, helping us to connect to Christ, our church, and our community contexts, both in person and online. Table Life is available from your favorite online distributors, including Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and Judson Press. For more information, visit my website, table-life.org. Back to our MI5 conversation with our guest, Dr. Tod Bolsinger. So what is next for you then? You kind of teased a new book. Are there any new ministries with that, or maybe a new edge for you in the consulting or at Fuller you want to share with us?
Well, so the work I'm doing at Fuller, we got a big Lilly grant that Lilly has been doing a really generous work with thriving congregations, and we got one of those big grants. And what we're looking at is comparing trying to figure out the ways we can make adaptive leadership training available to many different people. Like, so I do consulting with individual congregations, and we have some hybrid stuff we do with Fresh Expressions, where people go through an 18-month period where they do some face-to-face and some stuff online. And we have a grant to do an entirely online training process. So what we're really doing is we're actually studying in great depth, how do you develop adaptive capacity? How do you develop the capacity in leaders to be able to lead people through loss, to learn, to navigate competing values, to be able to figure out the difference between what is essential and expendable, and then experiment your way forward. Like, this is the basics of adaptive stuff. Can we do that for the whole church? That's the question we're asking. Or that anybody could be able to afford it or learn it.
Yeah.
And what's powerful is the part we kept running into was pastors would then begin to develop adaptive capacity, and they would begin to say, yeah, but our churches haven't been developed. Like, our people somehow, even though the gospel talks about death and resurrection, we don't think very much about death and resurrection of our congregations, of our churches, of the loss necessary to go forward to keep the mission forward. And so what I'm working on right now is really working with a lot of churches. I work with probably 60 churches right now in one level or another. How do we develop the spiritual formation practices that will develop within our congregations the capacity for healthy, wise, adaptive change?
Wow, that's really helpful. I actually just wrote an article for Word and Way, and I talk a little bit in there about many times at conferences, I'll hear the Netflix versus Blockbuster story, right? Mm-hmm. And how Netflix took down Blockbuster. And ultimately, the point of the story is don't be Blockbuster, don't close, don't be so tied to old models of ministry and these sort of things. Be a Netflix. And I've always struggled with that as a metaphor, because it always feels like if you're not on the cutting edge, if you're not thinking about things so very differently, then you're not going to be successful. You're not being faithful, or perhaps. And I recently walked past one of those red box machines. Have you seen these? There's like 40,000 of them all over the country. And Redbox just launched its IPO this week. One of the only businesses in the history of America to go public while having a declining revenue. And it's because they've made some new partnerships with a production company and with a Roku streaming service. And what they've discovered was their audience stays at home. They watch twice as many movies as anybody else in America. Their target audience, it still wants that physical DVD for a while. They know as a business, this is not a model that's going to be successful going forward, but they're going to continue to use the physical media until it's completely unsustainable while building their online platform.
Yeah.
And as I hear you describe this is sort of like the skills you're trying to give pastors, is this walking and shepherding of congregations from the DVD model to the streaming model. And that's kind of who's already in the church. And you don't always get the early adopters because they're already on Netflix, but you can't stay old because then you'll die like Blockbuster. And so I just like the idea of using Redbox as maybe an example, an encouraging example for our churches, is that it is sustainable to do both for a little while until you've transitioned to the next thing.
Yeah. Well, what's powerful about that illustration is they're also learning from Netflix. Netflix went from DVDs to streaming, right? Yeah. Which I always say, there are a few geniuses out there who are going to predict the future. I am not one of them. I am not one. I don't even try to predict the future. So I always tell people, don't try to predict. Instead, learn how to prototype. Prototype means how to do a small experiment where you can learn.
Yeah.
So if you can learn to say, let's try some small things that we can learn from, and then come back to them and ask, what can we learn next? That's that openness, that humility. See, I think the lesson about Blockbuster is they were arrogant. They were so much bigger than Netflix. They didn't think that Netflix idea was going to work. And what they missed was Netflix was saying, we're about movies. We're not about VHSs. Like, we're not about VCRs. We're about movies. And so now you start recognizing, oh, how can we be open and learn as we go? And that, to me, I think once the church recognizes that the very identity of a Christian is a learner. Yeah. That's the word disciple means, right? Discipleship means we are always learning and we are learners. And the character quality of humility is what's supposed to mark our life. And then we recognize we can take risks to learn because nothing is fatal with us. Yeah. There's no failure if you're learning. There's no failure that is fatal. We have forgiveness and we have assurance. So why aren't we the most humble, open, creative communities? Why instead do we find ourselves being so fearful and reactive? That's, to me, the question about discipleship that I want to work over, because I think a lot of the church is not only stuck in an old model, it's clinging to it as if it is, as if it's the essence, as if it's the thing. Yeah, that's it. I mean, that metaphor of loving movies more than the distribution of movies, right? That's the difference. We love the gospel more than the particular distribution of the gospel. Yeah. Well, you've got a lot going on. You've got the school, you've got the consulting stuff, you've got all the books and things. As we prepare to learn more deeply with you in the Zoom call on November 18th, how can we as American Baptists partner with you presently and going forward in ministry? Well, a couple things is one of the things I would just invite is anybody who comes to the workshop is to literally think to yourself, so could I get a small group of people together to experiment our way forward? Yeah. Like, could I get my own little core of discovery, my own little transformation team, my own little group of people? I mean, one of the things we've learned through our cohorts is if you put together 5 or 6 people and you say, hey, look, we're going to learn how to do this together, you can see amazing things begin to happen in your churches. I mean, clarity about your what I call your congregational charism. This is our unique values. This is our gift. Clarity about our community. This is where they need us. There's lots of places in pain in the world. We get to offer ourselves at this particular pain point. And here, because we have this opportunity to make a difference, here are some of the ways we can address the things that are keeping us back in our congregations. And so what I always say is, the invitation I have for folks is, yes, I'm glad you're reading the books and I'm thrilled to talk with you. What I really want to do is say, let's work together. Let's experiment our way forward and come join one of our cohorts or have us do some consulting with your area. Or, I talked to a pastor today in Pennsylvania who's got, she said, we have 60 people in worship and we got to figure out what our future is. And I'm working with a church in Texas that's got 10,000, and they've got the same questions. What is our future? And so it's not about size. It's not about scope or scale or impact or platform. It's about health and mission and community and the willingness that we have to move from surviving to thriving. And I just want to invite folks to, let's figure out ways that we can learn as we all go forward together. Very good. Well, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate you joining us on Mission in 5, the podcast, and I look forward to hearing more at our upcoming Adaptive Leadership Zoom meeting on November 18th. Thanks, Greg.
Well, thank you for listening to Mission in 5, the podcast. Be sure to subscribe so you will be notified every time we produce a new episode, introducing you to another ministry practitioner engaging with God's mission and their unique context in Nebraska, across the country, and around the world. If you really like the guests and the contents, take a moment to rate and review the podcast on your favorite streaming platform and share it with your friends and your larger social media network. Be sure to check out the show notes for links and contact information to each of our guests. Send us ideas on who you'd like us to interview for future episodes, and feel free to support us by giving through our PayPal link on our abcnebraska.com website. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.